But moving on, top 10 teams most likely to be a dynasty. What I looked at in terms of doing this is how young their core is, how good their core is, how good their prospect pool is, how tough their division is over the future. So let's get into it. Up first, the Minnesota Wild. The Minnesota Wild, obviously already a playoff team, around the 100-point team, and most of their key pieces are young, like Kaprizov, Ek, Addison, Gustafsson. Most of their key pieces are young, and they have a very good prospect pool. Yurov, Wallstead, Faber, Rossi, Height, Schrammel. So they not only have a pretty competitive, good young core right now, they also have a bunch of young guys coming up. I think they're going to need at least two of those prospects to become legit studs. Like Brock Faber is going to have to become a legit top pairing guy, because Boldy and Kaprizov should be good enough to be franchise players, but they're going to need some more stars, because right now, at least offensively, they don't quite have what it takes. They're going to need a little bit more depth in those guys to pan out. But the Wild have a very bright future. If they get a Nikita Kucherov out of Danila Yurov, Liam Ogren becomes a stud, they could go on a run. They could go on very much a run. The Buffalo Sabres. Some people might have the Buffalo Sabres higher. I can definitely see where you're coming from. They do have such a sick young core, as well as them being signed long-term. I just need to see them make the playoffs first. You know what I'm saying? Like, this core still is unproven, although they were only a couple spots out. They're going to be very much in the mix over the next couple of years. I just like some of the Eastern Conference teams maybe a little bit more, but the Buffalo Sabres are loaded. Next up, I got the Carolina Hurricanes. Still a relatively young team, and a team that consistently puts up over 110 points a year. I'm not sure they have the offensive firepower to end up winning the Stanley Cup, but you look at it, Svechnikov, Aho, Necas, Kakaniemi, Jarvis, they're all going to be there for the next decade, most likely, and they're going to have Rod Brindamore as the coach, assuming they pay him. So they're just going to be in the mix consistently. Could they win 2, maybe 3 Stanley Cups? If they put it together, it's definitely possible. I think for them, it's going to be essential that Seth Jarvis becomes a legit top line 65 to 70 point guy. So then they have Necas. They have like 4 elite forwards. And also Alexander Nikishin, their Russian defenseman prospect. He's going to have to replace Brett Burns once Brett Burns does start to regress, which is going to happen in like at least 2 years because he's 38 years old. So his development is going to be massive. He just tore up the KHL. But Alexander Nikishin needs to step up immediately and become an elite offensive defenseman for them, and they should be cooking. Dallas Stars, again, kind of similar to the Carolina Hurricanes, not as consistently good, but this year, a 108-point team. They got Hintz signed for 7 or 8 years at $8.4 million. Heiskanen has 6 years left. Jason Robertson, 3 years left at 7.4. Their core pieces, those 3, as well as Jake Ottinger, are going to be on the team and probably going to be on pretty team-friendly deals for the next decade. So they're probably my pick to make it out of the West next year. Could I see them go on an absolute tear? It's definitely possible. This one might be controversial. I have the Oilers. Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, as long as they're on the team, you can put the pieces around them, and they're going to be a highly competitive team, and they're always going to most likely have the 2 best, definitely the best player, probably the 2 best players in the entire league. Let me rephrase that. Whenever you have McDavid and Draisaitl, you're most certainly going to have the best player on the ice, probably the 2 best players on the ice, unless you play Colorado and then you got like a Kel McCarr or Nathan McKinnon, but you're probably going to by far have the 2 best players on the ice. So as long as they're in Edmonton, I could see them ripping off 3 Stanley Cups in 5 years starting next year. It's going to be tough. They're going to have to put the right pieces around. Stuart Skinner's going to have to develop, but it's looking very bright for them. Vegas Golden Knights, this one's a little bit interesting. They have the 1 Stanley Cup already, so they just need to win 2 in the next 7 years. I just have question marks about their future. I look at the guy looking up right there, Marchessault. Marchessault is already 32. Petrangelo's 33. Stone's 31. Carlson's 30. Stevenson's 28. Eichel and Theodore are like, they're 2 young guys, and even they are 26 and 27. So it's like if they don't get another Stanley Cup, they basically have to win the next 2 Stanley Cups to become that dynasty in the next 4 years, because most likely after that, they're going to have to enter some type of retool rebuild. I don't know. Again, Bill Foley's another stud like I was talking about before. Maybe he'll somehow make it work. But as of right now, I don't really love it. Next up, I got the Chicago Blackhawks. The Blackhawks, it's going to sound absurd because they're still a really bad team. But once you have that generational talent in a Connor Bedard, if you can just build it somewhat right, you have a decent chance at winning multiple Stanley Cups. You know what I'm saying? And I think with Kyle Davidson, the other guy pictured there, he knows that they can't rush into try to be competitive right now. They still have another 2 to 3 years of probably stinking getting high-end prospects. I like what they're building right now with Korchinski and Reichel. They have a bunch of other first-round picks from like the Lightning and a couple other teams, the Maple Leafs, I think. But the future is looking very bright with Connor Bedard. As long as they can get him, Korchinski develops into a number one defenseman. They get another stud center, a winger next year in the draft. It's going to be looking very good for the Blackhawks. I'm willing to bet Connor Bedard wins at least one Stanley Cup in Chicago. And we already saw them become a dynasty with Patrick Kane being the centerpiece. If they can find the Duncan Keith, find the Jonathan Toews, find the other pieces, it's perfectly possible. Moving on to number 3, we got the New Jersey Devils. So I think this is a pretty easy pick for me. Most of their core is young, below the age of 27, and locked up long term. These two obviously are on some of the best deals in all of hockey. So over the next 5 years, I think the expectation is definitely one Stanley Cup, maybe even 2. Can they get to that 3rd Stanley Cup in order to become a dynasty? Again, I don't think these teams are likely to become a dynasty. There's like a dynasty every 15 years, but it's definitely possible for the Devils, even though they haven't won one yet. Out of the teams that don't have a cup yet in the last 5 years or whatever, they're definitely the most likely to potentially become a dynasty, given their age, given their core. As long as Akira Schmid, Luke Hughes, and Simone Nemec pan out, they're not going to have a single weak spot on their team. Even when Dougie Hamilton starts to age, some of their other guys start to get old, they're going to be extremely elite and in their prime for the next 8 years. They can win 3 Stanley Cups. It's definitely possible. Number 2, Colorado Avalanche. They have taken a hit. If you asked me this last year, I'd say like, yeah, they're winning 2 Stanley Cups. 3 is probably like a 40% chance. But since then, I think the odds have kind of gone down of them potentially winning 3 Stanley Cups. They already have that 1, so they need to be number 2 on this list, and they are pretty young. As long as they have these 3 guys, they're going to be a top 4 team in the West for the next 5 years while they're in their prime. It's definitely going to be harder without Gabriel Landeskog now that he is potentially done forever. They're going to get LTIR relief, but they're not as scary as they used to be. They severely lack depth now that the Nathan McKinnon extension has kicked in. Mikko Rantanen's going to need extension in a year or 2. So I think they still are the cream of the crop in the West, and because they've done it and they're also pretty young. But in terms of being number 1 anymore, no, I wouldn't have them as like the most likely next dynasty. I think it's probably 35 to 40% chance they get a second one, because they're going to be a 105-point team the next 4 years. It's definitely possible. But at number 1's pretty obvious. I don't think this should be that much of a debate, even though I think their best days are behind them. It's Tampa Lightning. They already have 2, and 2 in the last 4 years. So they just need to win 1 more over the next 4 years. I don't think they're going to do it. I think their prime is definitely past them. But as long as Kucherov's still elite, Stamkos still gives you 80 to 90 points, a top 10 center, Hedman's half decent, Sergachev's now another stud. As long as their core pieces don't fall off a cliff, they're going to be a safe playoff team. They're going to be able to go on a deep playoff run. So with Vasilevsky in net, is it possible that he just goes absolutely berserk and ends up winning another Stanley Cup? It's definitely possible. So yeah, just given the fact that they already have the 2 Stanley Cups in 4 years, they just need to win 1 more to become that dynasty in my books. I think the Tampa Bay Lightning are pretty clearly the number 1 pick. But let me know in the comments. What do you think about this? Let me go to the full one. Whoops. But let me know in the comments. What do you think about this? This is about to be posted on Instagram. Most likely be the next NHL dynasty. Lightning, Avalanche, Devils, Blackhawks, Knights, Oilers, Stars, Hurricanes, Sabres, Wild.